I ask that writers and artists consider whether embracing an identity that is based in whole or in part on these social constructions merely reinforces those constructions. As author Cedric Dover stated so eloquently in 1937, today there are no half-castes because there are no full castes. While multiracial identities give the appearance of the deconstruction of social order based on race, I suggest possibly otherwise. For example, many multiracial Americans of African and European descent understandably attempt to claim and reassert their non-African ancestry, reminding us how they are a little French, a little Scottish, a little Italian. Few of us stop to ponder about the near utter destruction of their African ancestry, even with the inclusion of European ancestry, which has been reduced to black. While some may embrace a black-white identity, I ask, where are the Luba-Lithuanians? Where are the Shona Scottish? Where are the Ewe Estonians? Where are the Igbo Icelanders? They used to be our identities told us, and others, where we came from, what we did, how we hunted, where we fished, where we pressed our wine, how we made our cheese, when we planted, how we worshipped, and how we lived. Only a few seem to know or notice how these nearly infinite identities, even those from Europe, have been reduced through the centuries by the onslaught of white supremacy to just a few handful exploitable commoditized categories. We think we can manipulate these morally corrupt framework. We can manipulate the morally corrupt framework of race into a modern utopia, but even these so-called new hybrid identities may be reabsorbed or be discarded back into these oppressive essentialist elements. Individuals and groups today, in 2011, that insist and demand that we tell our quote-unquote whole racial truth are no less misguided and insidious than the Virginians who insisted on racial integrity back in 1924. While some may criticize President Obama as for identifying as black, who here knows that quote-unquote black Mildred Loving had European ancestry and Native ancestry on both sides of her family tree. What I would like to do is also ask that creators in this room, if they could create projects that could consider life, what life would be in our society without race. My second area of discussion is by far my personal favorite, and unfortunately very often neglected in the non-academic contemporary discourses. Hopefully those in this audience will make my complaint its used upon history. No serious discussion about multiracialism can begin without an understanding of history. History is not merely important, it is essential. Without an understanding of the past, we shall not only fail at transforming the future, we shall merely repeat it. Loving versus Virginia was the final battle in a 50-year struggle to repeal all anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. For many, the history of multiracial America, even if one bothers to discuss history, begins in 1967 with Loving. Yet even the history of this one case suggests that the genesis of multiracial America began much earlier. As Kevin Millarks has said, quote, looking back to Loving as the official birth of multiracial America reinforces the prevailing memory of racial separatism while further underscoring the illegitimacy of miscegenation's past. By establishing racial freedom in marriage, Loving also sets a misleading context for the history of mixed-race America. Even though Loving instigates an open acceptance of interracialism, it unintentionally creates a collective memory that mixed-race people and relationships did not exist before 1964. The fact that Richard Perry Loving and Mildred Dolores Jeter began their courtship in 1950 when he was 17 and she was 11 clearly indicates that the relationship was not transgressive as far as their families were concerned. The fact that the Jeters made it clear that Richard wasn't the quote, the first white person in our family indicates that Mildred, like most black Americans, had heterogeneous ancestry. Perhaps the reason that the 1950s Loving-Jeter courtship was not transgressive within their families was because their relationships were not transgressive within their community of Caroline County, Virginia, which was known as the passing capital of America because so many light-skinned blacks were mistaken for whites. Lovingday.org provides us with what as far as I can tell, the only interactive state-by-state map of anti-miscegenation laws that I know. It is indeed, as they put it, cool. Yet despite the vast information about these statutes, we're giving no overarching reason why these laws were enacted in the first place. Nor are we told who wrote these laws. The site does correctly say, quote, "The judiciary system played an important role in regulating interracial relationships," end quote. Yet something very important is missing from these texts. Fortunately for us, we have a scholar like Peggy Pascoe who tells us the whole truth. The first paragraph of her multiple award-winning book, What Comes Naturally? Miscegenation Law and the Making of Race in America, states, this book examines two of the most insidious ideas in American history. The first is the belief that interracial marriage is unnatural. The second is the belief in white supremacy. When those two ideas converged, with the invention of the term miscegenation in the 1860s, the stage was set for the rise of a social and political and legal system of white supremacy that reigned throughout the 1960s, and many would say beyond. This section is probably the most difficult to discuss. It is perhaps the most pervasive. No force in American history has had stronger influence on identity than that of white supremacy. While it's tempting to frame the Lovings as a case of love denied by racial difference, it is more, much more. Anti-miscegenation laws did much more than prevent marital unions between men and women of different races. Anti-miscegenation laws, in fact, transformed the fiction of race into social reality. In fact, they created race. Their enforcement meant that a person's racial identity had to be determined in order to receive a marriage license. Furthermore, variation in punishments based on the determined race of the litigants reinforced the idea of racial hierarchy. Whereas a white person and an Indian would face a $200 fine and 2 years in prison, a white person and a black person would face $500 fine and 5 years in prison. Anti-miscegenation laws also disenfranchised spouses and children. To make matters worse, the idea of racial hierarchy was embraced even in states that had no anti-miscegenation laws. These laws affected all people of color regardless of their marital status. In fact, in short, anti-miscegenation laws were the cornerstone of white supremacy. Yet despite the multitudes of non-academic discourses celebrating the demise of these laws, absolutely no mention is made of the term white supremacy. On January 6, 1959, just 6 months after police entered through the unlocked doors of the Lovings and arrested the newly married sleeping couple for violating the Racial Integrity Act of 1964, they were sentenced to 1 year in prison. The sentence was suspended on the condition that they leave the state for 25 years. After passing sentence, the trial judge in the case, Leon M. Brazil, infamously proclaimed, "The Almighty God created the races black, yellow, Malay, and red. And he placed them on separate continents, but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend the races to mix," end quote. Although Judge Brazil's statement is ostensibly about the prevention of what he saw as putative marriages, the closer examination reveals a more sinister agenda. For him, not only did Mildred and Richard Loving not belong in the same bed, they and all of their quote-unquote representative racial contingents did not belong on the same continent. Although Jim Crow segregation could not send the races back to their quote-unquote home continents, it did the next best thing by consigning the races to their separate schools, separate theaters, separate hospitals, separate water fountains. Much like his predecessors almost nearly 300 years before, Brazil reaffirmed the framework of white supremacy and the oppression of people of color via the ruse of anti-miscegenation. Although we owe a debt of gratitude to the courageousness of Richard and Mildred Loving that can never be repaid, we should use care on how we celebrate their interracial marriage. The increased attention towards multiraciality has brought appropriately more scrutiny, particularly from the academic community. More scholars than ever are examining the role of multiraciality within the framework of racial justice in the United States and abroad. In the case of Latin America, critics have begun to argue that multiracialism, like the firmly discredited concept of Brazilian racial democracy, functions as an ideology that masks enduring racial injustice and thus blocks substantial political and social and economic reform. The clever positioning by activists of the loving marriage as a 1960 vanguard of multiraciality promotes several troubling ideologies that should be exposed and examined. These ideologies effectively distance the loving saga from the greater African American struggle for freedom and justice. Firstly, the emphasis of the marriage of Richard and Mildred Loving implies that unjust anti-miscegenation laws had no adverse impact towards Black Americans and other people of color as a whole. Secondly, 1967, most importantly, the continued myth of the increased multiracial birth since the Loving decision is a maneuver that illogically seeks to erase history of 3 centuries of interracial marriages, the offspring of those marriages, and the millions of descendants of those offspring. As I have stated before, we are not becoming a multiracial society. We already are a multiracial society and have been so for centuries. The past 2 years have brought forth an unprecedented amount of critical examination of multiracialism. Articles, books, live programs, even a conference. The first critical mixed race conference that was held in DePaul and will be held next year, and I think everyone here who can go should go, forces us to ask serious and important questions about how multiracialism and how multiracial identities may impact racial dynamics here and abroad. Even Dr. Naomi Zack, who many of you saw in the film Multiracial Identity this morning, defending the political recognition of a multiracial identity, has since the film retracted that position in her article titled "The Fluid Identity, the Fluid Symbol of Mixed Race" in the fall 2010 issue of Hypatia. With the next 2 years promising even more scrutiny of the discussion surrounding multiracialism, it is more important than ever that we all read the academic texts that help us create projects and help create a greater impact. As you begin to read these texts, you'll discover that, in turn, most of these scholars, as you begin to read these texts, you'll discover that most of these scholars, in turn, read texts from other scholars. And the scholar that most of them refer to is University of California at Santa Barbara professor of sociology, G. Reginald Daniel. I can think of no one more equipped to discuss the importance of context than Dr. G. Reginald Daniel. Dr. Daniel adds a wealth of knowledge and personal experience to the discussion of multiracialism in the United States and abroad. Born into a multi-generational and multiracial family in the segregated United States in 1949, Dr. Daniel provides a much-needed historical context in the framing of multiracial identity in the United States. He has always identified as multiracial, even at a time when public expression of such identity was non-existent. His life and his work are representative of the many facets of the multiracial experience, including activism, self-expression, loss, a longing of community, stigmatization, celebration, and pride. In addition, Dr. Daniel has been more than generous in sharing his vast knowledge and views and vision of a post-racial future to me and many others. In my opinion, Dr. Daniel's lifelong experience as an educator, author, activist, and advisor make him the most knowledgeable person on the topic of multiracialism anywhere. Since the spring of 1989, he has taught Betwixt and Between, which is one of the first courses in the United States to deal specifically with the question of multiracial identity, comparing the United States with various parts of the world. And as of today, the course is the longest currently standing one in the United States dealing with the topic. He has produced several chapters and books, including his passage in Pluralist, Subverting the Racial Divide Beyond Black and White, New Multiracial Consciousness. He's also the author of Black and White Identity in the New Millennium, Unsevering the Ties That Bonds, which he's included in the second comprehensive examination of multiracial identity in the United States. He is also author of two really great books, which is called Race and Multiracial in Brazil, and the Race and Multiraciality in Brazil and the United States, Converging Paths, and More Than Black, Multiracial Identity and the New Racial Order. It's also his third singularly authored monograph, Racial Identity and the Brazilian Novelist, The Life of and Writings of Machado de Assis. Did I pronounce that right? Is now under contract and tentatively scheduled for publication in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, G. Reginald Daniel.
Thank you, Steve. I hope you don't mind if I end up sitting. I feel like I need the security of the